middle of May, which means Dracula Daily is in full swing. In honor of everyone's favorite Substack email-based classic literature experience, I decided to theme this month around beach babe vampires, and today we're working on the man himself. The only problem is there's so many ways to go about this character because he's been adapted roughly 20,000 times. Are we going for the classic Bela Lugosi, with his elegant coiffed hair and debonair vibes? What about BBC's recent Dracula adaptation, whose costume department decided to dress him like a cheap Halloween costume? Are we going for the Christopher Lee hammer horror half-crazed bloodlust energy? What about a more battle-ready Dracula, with like the version from Dracula Untold, which seemingly focuses more on his status as a warrior and battle tactician? What about the actual real-life person, Vlad the Impaler, with his waxy-ass mustache and long curls? What about Amazon's Dracula, which looks for all the world like BBC Dracula's even less cool cousin? Are we even considering Adam Sandler's Hotel Transylvania Dracula? I'm overcomplicating this. Let's go over my choices. I decided to start with the Draculas I actually wanted to pay homage to, while still sticking to the theme of beach vampires, and who's got a beachier vibe than Castlevania's Dracula. I love in particular his long wavy hair that kind of falls looser. He's maybe a 2A or 2B on the hair texture scale, and doesn't seem to be styling his hair. It reminds me of the texture someone with mostly straight hair generally gets when their hair is hit with seawater. He also has a very casual elegance and bearing that I want to emulate in the final design. He seems like he knows luxury and is comfortable serving cunt, and I want that to be a big part of his final vibe. I'm also taking a lot from the 1993 classic Bram Stoker's Dracula, specifically the long, flowing scarlet robe he wears when he's in his decrepit old man form, and then again the hip and fashionable kind of svelte energy he has going on when he's in his younger form. Another version that has a very specific cunty vibe that I want to emulate. As far as the vibes go here, it's feeling a bit staid in terms of what we think of as Dracula, though. We're going to be branching out somewhat from here because it's a good foundation, but none of it is beachy or relaxed, so we're going to mix things up with the references here. I wanted to pull a bit from Ed Teach in Our Flag Means Death. He has Dilfy swag and long salt and pepper waves that, when he's just hanging around, are usually swept half up in a kind of romantic old surfer man bun hairstyle that I thought would suit our distinguished and slightly dilfier Dracula. I also took a bit from the cuntiest Dracula on this list, the unused Dracula concepts from Hotel Transylvania, who also has a salt and pepper look going on and a nice strong nose and jaw. I also saw this cute pair of boxers by the European lingerie brand Videnoir, whose stuff I love but cannot afford, and thought, hey, that would be a perfect look for a beachy Dracula. So with all these references and vibes, let's get started on the sketch. Starting in Clip Studio here, I lay down a symmetry ruler in the approximate center of the canvas because it's much faster than getting out of T-pose if I'm not necessarily considering symmetry. I block in the basic body shapes and adjust the size of my canvas to make sure I get his legs and feet in before starting on sketching the basic shapes for the hair and how I want it to fall. I actually turned the symmetry ruler off for a second here to work on the tendrils and get them looking really soft and beautifully unstyled. I then turned the ruler back on and tried to find ways to give myself more room before eventually making the canvas wider so I can fit the side profile perspective of our character into the sketch. From there, using the work I've already done as a guide, I begin adding lines to indicate where body parts go on the canvas. This will help me keep on model when I start working on the side profile of the character, which will then make it much easier to keep proportions right while I model it in 3D. In eventual service to this step, I quickly sketch in the face before going back to creating guides for each bit of the face as well, like the hairline, eyeline, nose tip, and lips. I'm using boxes instead of plain lines for this step because it's basically impossible not to get a straight line if you're using boxes. I had a professor when I took painting as a major in college prior to moving to the UK that told me that I couldn't draw straight lines to save my life, and I definitely agree. So in order to keep my line straight across instead of a little bit slanty, I use boxes. You can use rulers to each point and use a line tool straight across from there, but it's extra work and I don't feel it necessary. Now I start to block in the side profile for this Dracula, using the guidelines we laid down a little bit earlier. I like to make my models caked up a bit, because it's a good flex of skill making a relatively low number of polygons look curved and soft and plush, and this Dracula will, as a result, have a nice round booty. Zooming in here, we're immediately working on a nice strong nose for Dracula. The man himself was from Transylvania, a province in Romania. A lot of their hottest male models from there have quite strong protuberant noses and brows, so our Dracula will have a similar shape to his facial profile. I also give him quite a high arch for his brows, because I love the look of a dramatic downsloping brow. It gives him a more intense and slightly brooding energy. We're just roughly sketching in his hair now. You see I've had a bit of trouble lining it up to the front-on view of our sketch here, but I get it looking close enough in the end, and now we can get to his very sparse clothing. I'm just quickly sketching in the contrast bat detailing on his boxer shorts before roughing in a hugely simplified version of Old Man Dracula's long flowing scarlet robes in the 1993 film. The original version has a lot more construction going on in the sleeves and massive train, but because this is a beach version, we're going to pare down the concept so it more closely reflects a beach cover-up, somewhere in the vicinity of bathrobe but with less structure and more volume. And I'm just adding all the little clothing details to our side profile sketch before coming up with a list of possible accessories for him. Now that we're done with the concept sketch, we can begin to work on the 3D model. I start by bringing my sketch into the workspace, aligning it to the center and duplicating it, rotating the duplicate 90 degrees on the z-axis so it can act as my depth and profile reference. From there, I begin with the basic box, subdividing it once and applying the modifier so I have an easier shape as a base to work with. After deleting half the model on the x-axis, I add a mirror modifier, so the modeling only needs to happen on one side and will be symmetrical on the other side. Note that I'm not applying it at this stage because I want it active until the end of the process. Now I'm adding points and geometry to the model so I can form rough shapes that will be a good base for further streamlining and fixing into the final model. I'm just pushing and pulling, adding more line cuts for structure before pulling these faces down. These form the groin and hip region and will eventually be extruded into legs, but they need to be pulled and shaped into the right foundation for that, which is why I've got them in this V-like formation. And while we're on this, no, I'm not going to be giving him a visible bulge. I'm not sure how I would rig that, frankly, and also it would be a bit tasteless and tacky, so sorry, bulge enjoyers. Anyway, Dracula is a less horny male 3D character I'm working on this month, so maybe I'll give Lestat some subtle dick and balls. What Dracula won't be lacking is a pair of soft, subtle pecs. As I stated, previously, soft organic shapes are a bit of a flex, and I love to flex this skill in particular. Giving every model I make boobs is fun, so I couldn't very well ignore it in my main Mandrake here. I started by insetting these 4 quads here, pulling the verts around so they create a pleasing man-tit shape before extruding out a few times, scaling the verts down each time so it tapers into a nice rounded cube sort of shape. I then add a few more cuts to give them better geometry and more manipulable points before hopping into the sculpt mode to gently coax them with a pull brush into something with a bit more cleavage and push. I then jump back into edit mode to fix the mesh problems this created. Since it's all happening so close to the mirror seam, it fucks with the geometry of the other quads here, which means I have to then clean up the quads that have their points pushed together. This creates messy mesh problems down the line, so I just delete the problematic areas and fill in the spaces as needed. From there, it's more push and pull, refining shapes in sculpt mode as necessary and fixing any problem areas in edit mode. Before adding another horizontal cut to define his ribcage. Before going back into sculpt mode to get it just noticeable but not like he's starving. I then give him a belly button by extruding a small quad in the lower middle section of the torso inwards and arranging the points around it so it looks gradual before adding a few extra cuts in the same area to give him a pronounced Adonis belt. This is a hot, Dilfy Dracula, and I want him lean and toned because Dracula wouldn't suit a muscular body. Now, onto the legs. I'm just extruding those hips we created earlier, just blocking the shapes in and keeping them properly aligned with the front sketch before adding more cuts and moving them around to create a softer and more gradual slope of his hips. I then realized a great deal of the model wasn't aligned to the side profile sketch and spent a bit of time futzing with it to get it to conform a little closer to the reference. I then cut out a big chunk of the existing geometry where his ass will eventually be, before pulling the verts into a rounder shape along their normals. I then grab all the verts where the ass cheek will be and extrude them inwards first and then pull those new verts outwards. Using the side profile of the sketch as a guide for the depth of the ass, I repeat this step until the verts are basically touching each other and then I merge all the points. It looks pretty shit at first, but then I jump into sculpt mode to sort of stroke the points into a rounder and more butt-like shape. I added a few more cuts around the butt cheek to further hone in on the rounded shape I wanted, pulling geometry around with the pull and smooth brushes to get it to the right shape. Looking at the front once more, I realized the belly button needed fixing, so I deleted all those quads and went in again. Similar to how I did the ass, extruding the verts I needed, going inwards first towards each other, before extruding into the model's body itself to create a little cavity. I moved the adjoining verts around so it eased into the body a bit more naturally, as before, and moved up to work on the arms. And the process was similar to the ass. I moved the points into a more rounded configuration and extruded those quads, only this time outwards along the x-axis. I continued following the reference, adding more geometry as needed. I then went about creating the geometry for the knees, which basically meant finding the deepest recess of the leg on the back, creating a rounded shape out of the vertices around it. I usually go for about 6 or 8, and then setting the quads inwards there to create a more pronounced recess. I then find their corresponding quads on the front of the leg and do the same, except instead of dragging insets further inward, I drag them a bit outward, scaling them down to create the slightly protruding shape of a kneecap. I do basically the same thing on the arms for the elbows, except instead of looking for recesses, I just kind of try to find the midpoint of the arm and follow the same steps from there, reversing it so the inside of the elbow is facing the front and the pointed elbow corner faces the back. This is to make sure the body will deform nicely when rigged. I then clean up the model somewhat so it looks nicer and more recognizable as human in proportion, making the arms taper out from the wrist and back in into the elbow before out again towards the shoulder through the biceps, before I start on the hands. I grab the outermost quads on the wrist and duplicate them, facing them forward so I can edit from above, and from there I do the same hand I've always done. I create a quad per finger by adding cuts as necessary, subdivide one of the horizontal cuts so I can create triangles for a better knuckle isolation, and correct the geometry as necessary before extruding out each finger at a slight angle for a bit of a spread. This makes it much easier to rig, as Automatic Rig Pro can sometimes get the fingers confused and add bones where they shouldn't go. I do this for each finger, adding a new loop cut and moving them along the normals to where each knuckle joint should go before tapering each finger off into a rounded point. I then add geometry as needed, moving the verts around on the sides of the hand until it looks right, before creating another rounded foundation of verts for the thumb and rotating it on the x-axis a bit so it faces a little bit inward at all the other fingers. I then repeat the finger process for the thumb, extruding it outwards but keeping it neat so it looks good with all the other fingers. I then go into sculpt mode to fix any shape problems before hitting edit mode again and using the knife tool to isolate the thumb and pinky lines on the palm so I can inset the rest of the quads between those lines and under the first row of finger quads. This is to create the look of the palm without adding too much geometry. I bring it back to its join location and line it up next to the wrists on the body model so I get a better feel for how proportional it is. I then edit it as needed with proportional editing, pulling whole sections of the hand to get it sized up nicely. I join this guy back up to the body by reducing the number of vertices around the outer wrist, where it will join up to the arm, so the join is neat before using the bridge option in the Loop Tools menu to lock it there without the need for remeshing. I then begin to build the base for the neck and start extruding upwards, editing vertices for shape as necessary and adding more loop cuts where they're needed for extra geometry. From there, I pull down to the bottom of the model to start working on his feet, extruding and pushing and pulling the points as necessary to create a foundation for the feet to be properly supported. Then I kind of had to extend the feet as they were looking a bit front heavy with nothing on the back. After that, it's just continuing to extrude, sculpt the feet so they're the right shape, and then refine the shape by adding more loop cuts and playing with the shapes. Once I got them looking right, I gave him ankles using the same method I described for the knees and elbows above, but on the inside and outside of his legs instead of front and back. I then grabbed the 2 front quads on the leftmost side and extruded to make toes, again adding loop cuts and tapering where necessary for the shape. I repeated these steps going outwards until all 5 toes were finished, and then refined the shape of the foot until it was the right length and curvature. And you can just sort of see me moving back and forth around the body to address problem areas, moving them around so that it all looks smooth and good. Now that the body is mostly finished, we can get started on the head and face. I start the same way as I did on the body, using a subdivided square that I apply the mod to and cut in half for mirroring. I block in all the shapes as a base and work around the face quickly to create the infrastructure required for the detail that I'll be building into it later. I delete a few faces for the eye holes and shape them, using the front facing as a reference before pulling them back along the y-axis to give the brow and nose more definition. I work on the basic nose shape, getting the nostrils extruded upward into the head, and shape the face as required to create his lips. I extrude those points inward and add loop cuts to define the shape and add more manipulable geometry. This has the unintended consequence of giving him stupid cheekbones, which takes a lot of futzing to properly correct. I can't really tell you how I fixed it here because I was pushing and pulling and using sculpting brushes until it looked good, and I can't give specifics. I extrude into the face through his 2 eye holes after fixing the shape a little more to give him eye sockets, before then adding 2 spheres to shape the eyelids around. It's more adding loop cuts and getting the points situated using sculpt mode and pushing and pulling until it looked right. I think it's around here that I got the weird face fold out and got the cheeks looking nice. From there I add cubes for the ears. I scale them so they're smaller and thinner on the y-axis before adding and applying a subdivision modifier so I can play with a more rounded shape. I then angle them on the x-axis so they're pointing outward but not completely horizontal. I then extrude the back to give it that cup shape most ears have, inset a few quads on the front and pull them back, add a few loop cuts for the whorls and extrude a few quads horizontally for the tragus before heading into sculpt mode to smooth it all out. I continue in sculpt mode to shape it into a proper ear, hopping back and forth between edit and sculpt just to get it right. After that, it's time to start on his eyebrows and lashes. I start with a mirror mod cube that I also give a subdivide modifier that we aren't going to apply this time. I find it helps give the right shape for brows and lashes for some reason. It must be all the anime I watch. This is generally how their face hair that isn't a beard looks. So this is just why I like it, and it always looks nice in my opinion. Anyways, the cube is scaled down real small and squished along the y-axis so it's very thin, and then aligned with the brow. Most people would choose to turn on snap to faces here, but I fucking hate that shit. It messes my workflow up so bad, so we're ignoring it. We're extruding the rightmost quads of the cube along the x-axis, adjusting the rotation where necessary, following the curve of the sketch. If it doesn't quite hit the brow ridge, that's fine, we can always push those quads back into the face later. I do the exact same for the eyelashes, closely following the shape of the eye with the quads in question for extruding out on the rightmost edge to give him a cuntier and more well-defined wing-type lash line. I go back into the corner to basically do the same thing on there as well. I tried to give him facial hair, kind of like a bit of a goatee, but I end up deleting it. I don't think it looked good at all, so it's gotta go. Here's his fangs. They're kind of small because his lips are so thick, but I can't make Dracula and not give him long, exaggerated canines. I'll be fixing this for the printable version, probably. Now I grab all the head stuff and scale it down so it's the right size for his body, tweaking bits of the neck so it looks right. I also added some definition to his neck off cam, so that's why it looks a little bit more fleshed out. But now that the head is situated, we can get started on his hair. And if you guessed that it was more subdivided mod, mirror mod cubes, you would be correct. I just push and pull on these cubes to create a lovely wavy hairstyle with face framing tendrils and soft waves down the back with bits that are pulled up around the temples to prepare for the bun. From there, it's just duplicating the meshes as necessary around the head to create a full head of hair. The bun itself is a really small torus with a small inner radius to add thickness that I added a multi-res modifier to and masked little sections off before inflating to create a bun shape. I know this hair step is usually done using curves, and you totally can. I normally use curves myself, but I find this works better for hair with a bit more texture and body. It's less of a hassle to manipulate, in my opinion. Once the hair mostly covers his head, you can apply the mirror modifier and begin to play with the forms you've created to add a bit of contrast and non-uniformity. Now that we're all done with his face and hair, let's make his outfit. I start off with his robe by adding a plane this time, but hitting it with a mirror mod that doesn't have clipping checked yet, so the robe can be open. I scaled it up really big and flare out the bottom so that it covers his body. Adding loop cuts where necessary to pad out volume, and closing the back by ticking the box that says clipping and shutting the gaps. I then head into sculpt mode to make sure the robe conforms to the lines of the body, so it hangs loosely but it still fits against him where it matters. I also lengthen it in the back by pulling the vertices so it drapes a bit like a train, before hopping back into edit mode to give him sleeve holes by extruding up and along his back and up his chest. I give the front gap a nice structured edge by extruding outwards a bit and adding a few loop cuts before rounding it out slightly using the new vertices. I then simply extrude the sleeves out so they're about as far as his mid-palm and hang down a bit like in the reference image, giving the sleeves more geometry and a slightly structured hem as I go. I then have to correct the hair in sculpt mode a bit so it doesn't overlap with the robe. Super easy shit, just drag the hair back and forth as necessary with the grab tool until it all hangs over the robe and not intersecting with it. Now we're going to duplicate his groin / ass / upper thigh area to create his shorts. I then go into edit mode on these new shorts to correct the vertices as necessary to imitate simple shorts construction, make the hemlines on the leg curve a little bit less dramatically, close any gaps, and create a straighter waistline that doesn't go up so high. I do something similar for the flip-flops, duplicating the feet until they hit the base of the toe and extruding those front vertices until they would cover the bottoms of the toes, then grabbing the whole shape and extruding downwards to create a shape that has body. I then take the quad from between the thumb toe and second toe and extrude it up along the z-axis until it comes up from between them, and I can add a loop cut in the middle to start extruding out the straps, which I do the same as the eyebrows until they get closer to the outer foot section, around halfway down the y-axis of the foot, and then attach it to any quad in the area with the bridge function of the Loop Tools menu. It's a similar operation on the intersection, just follow the same steps around the thumb toe area. After that, all that's left to model are the silly rounded glasses that Gary Oldman's younger Dracula wears in the 1993 film, which I figured would be perfect since he's at the beach and will need to shade his eyes. I start with a circle mesh that I've added a mirror mod to, closing that by extruding the verts inward a couple times to create a concave surface, but instead of closing it like a point like I did with the ass cheeks, I grid filled them and added loop cuts for more geometry. After that, it's just a lot more extrusions, starting from the outermost edge, extruded along the y-axis to give a bit of protuberance. I then place them closer like how glasses would look on a person's face. I extrude it inwards just to fill it in a little, but that's not really necessary. I then play around with the already extant loop cuts around the lenses, pulling an edge in to create a lip to act as the glasses frame, and then adding a couple more loop cuts around the lenses and glasses frames for definition. Pushing and pulling is needed. I then took an outer face near the nose bridge and extruded it towards the center of the face along the x-axis to create the bridge of the glasses. And I do another extrusion from the outer face near the temples to create the temples of the glasses, and that's it. You don't really need to block in textures. I just like to do it because it's fun for me. It's like an adult coloring book. I just create textures that will light well and accurately reflect the look I'm going for here. I find this part fun because then I get to go in and work on the lighting on the model, which I find to be really relaxing and enjoyable. It's the end of the model and you're just putting some sauce on the final render, you know? Anyway, before finishing up on everything, I come back to the modeling at the end here to add nips to the model. It's the same technique as the tits themselves, just with a smaller spread. And that's a finished model. I had a lot of fun working on him and making him look as cunty as I could, while still holding true to the aesthetics I wanted to shoot for. I think overall he came out looking really, really good and attractive, while still being an older and more mature take on the character of Dracula. I hope you liked this video. I've been pretty bad at recording these time lapses, but I'm hoping I get better at remembering because I really like making them, and I think it can be super helpful for people to follow along with on their first projects. I know the classic choice for learning is the Blender Donut, but I figured it would be fun to have a few videos where you learn something more advanced than that. I don't know, maybe it's just me that doesn't learn from a set project, but I'm hoping that showing my workflow will allow any viewers to take what they need from my process and adapt it to suit their needs. Anyway, that's it for me this month. I'll see you again in June for a new project.